ideas. Without further ado, let's welcome Lydia Symchych, video game designer with ELB Learning. Lydia, the webinar is yours.
Hello. Welcome. So this is the webinar that you signed up for, and don't worry, we are going to talk about enhancing your learning retention and designing games in general. But I want to expand a little bit past this title to talk about how do we make games that positively impact others. My name is Lydia Symchych. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I call myself a positive impact video game designer. So how did I get here? Well, after I graduated from undergrad, I did not know what I wanted to do, which is not surprising for me. But I did realize that I loved learning and I loved to teach, but I didn't want to work in a school where I only was teaching one thing to the same age range of students. So after I graduated, I actually started in museums. I did a couple internships with Rice County Historical Society and with the Montshire Museum of Science. And through that, I learned that I really was interested in museum exhibit design. I got my first job in games with Filament Games in Wisconsin during the COVID-19 pandemic, and further honed my skills with Code Coven during a game developer boot camp they ran, as well as one other educational game developer before joining ELB Learning now. And when I was making this timeline, it was kind of wild to me to see that I've been working in games for 4 years and actually designing for 6. Before all of that, though, before I even had a concept of a career or what it could be, I grew up in the renaissance of educational PC games. You can even see in this picture of me with a computer which game I am playing. This area of time, late 90s and early 2000s, really shaped my sense of what educational media was. And it gave me this innate literacy for educational games and in general interactive content and how it can be used to teach new things and reinforce concepts. So I call myself a positive impact designer because I work on therapy games, educational games, training games. Any game that I am working on always has the bend of we want the learner to leave the game better than when they started, or with something new, or with a different perspective. And so that fits the best for me in terms of the work I do. If anything in this presentation seems interesting or cool or just really seems to jive with what you like, I would also encourage you to look at projects or the work of designers who fall under these other categories. Educational design, alternative design, meaning specifically not just entertainment video games, but alternatives to that. We will talk a lot about instructional design, and there are some brilliant instructional designers at ELB Learning. And then also emotional design and experience design tend to overlap with the kind of work that. So keep that in mind. In the spirit of learning and positive impact, we're going to talk a little bit about the process that I take as a designer when I look at a game and I go, okay, content, we want to translate this into a video game. How do we do that? I have about 4 steps that I go through, and I'm going to go through them with a specific bend to training games. Keep in mind that this same process can be used for education or therapy, but I'm going to make specific examples for training games. So hopefully you can look at your own educational content or your own training content and start to think, is this actually a good fit for a game? And even better, maybe empower you to be able to make your own games, either in partnership with ELB Learning or using some of the tools like the Training Arcade. Before any design happens, we have to actually understand the needs. What are the problems we're solving? What are the goals we want to accomplish? Why are we even? We call the goals for a game or for a design the impact objectives. This is, what do we want this game to do for your learners? It is the central point, the touchstone, the North Star, whatever analogy you have for this. This is what we aim for. And it is so important that we recognize and deeply understand and accept that it cannot and should not do everything. It can't do everything, And because that would just take forever, it'd be huge. And it shouldn't do everything because it would do everything pretty poorly, like this Swiss Army knife, which seems generally unusable. It is a very hard thing to do. It is a lot easier to say. So remember, it is okay. It cannot do everything, and it is not supposed to. With that in mind, we have to look at all of the content we're going to be teaching, all of your training, and going to start sifting through it. I encourage you to have 3 buckets. Stuff that we're going to cover in one game, stuff you're going to save for later to make future games, because guess what? You can always make more games. And then if sifting between those 2 is hard, maybe start with looking at what can be handled outside of a game. Every form of media has its limitations. Games are no exception. They're not great for everything. And so really consider what would be best served by being in a game and what would be disserved by being in a game. For example, you could probably teach food safety, like sanitation concepts through a game, but learning knife skills and how to sharpen and use knives would probably be best done in a kitchen with someone else. Now that we have the content in the buckets, let's look inside the bucket that says this game and go, okay, what is the focus here? You want it to be very, very narrow, and you want it to be pretty concise. The best way to think about what is the goal for this game is finish the sentence, this game should. So this game should train food workers in food safety best practices. This game should teach seniors how to recognize and report scam calls and emails. This game should introduce Minnesota history to kids in Twin Cities elementary schools. These are the goals of our game. Notice the fact that I said goals, plural. So as you're going through that bucket and looking at the content you want to focus on in this game, you will find other very important goals and other impact objectives that you either want to color or that are intrinsic also to the main focus. These are your secondary impact objectives. So if we expand this sentence, it would be, this game should introduce Minnesota's history to kids in Twin City elementary schools, and also support translation to Spanish, Somali, and Hmong, which are 3 of the languages most common in the Minnesota public school system. You could also, these other impact objectives can be specifically for accommodation. It could be because this other thing works very well. So like food workers and food safety and teamwork between the workers, but really make sure you also identify and honor those, because these are going to become what we call design pillars. So the roof of this structure is the main goal, the primary impact objective. This is what we want to make the game about. Everything else are the pillars are then the secondary impact objectives that support that main goal. So it could be accessibility, accommodations, other concepts that are prerequisite to teaching the main goal effectively, but everything at the bottom is supporting that main goal. As you go forward, keep in mind what your design pillars are and go back to them, because when you are staring down all of the work you have to do, all the content, it's very worthwhile going back to this and saying, does this thing I want to add support or relate to at least one of these design pillars, if not the main goal? If it doesn't, you can more comfortably say, we'll cut it or save it for later. This is your thesis statement of your game. Everything should go back to this. So now let's think about who's going to be playing your game. It's the learner, right? That's what we're making this game for. And yeah, it is the learner, but it's not just the learner. You see, the person playing the game is only part of the equation. There are the people who would be administering this game. There are the people who would be affected by the positive impact around the learner after they leave their game. So in some cases, the learner could be an employee, and the employee's supervisor is also going to have requirements of the game, needs of the game, will have input on how it needs to be built in order for it to be successful. Maybe it's a patient, and then the patient's therapist or the patient's caregivers that will be influenced by the effects of this game, or the way that this game is administered. This is also extremely important, and you have to balance the needs of the player and the learner and the needs of the people around them. This is especially true when we think about what part of the learning process is the game going to fit into. So when you think, so a teacher may want and need some form of assessment mechanic so they can actually see how the student is doing in relation to the content or in relation to their peers or in relation to a school district mandatory number. But the student may really need a place to practice. You have to kind of think about that. Introduction, practice, review, self-assessment, assessment, and synthesis sound kind of obtuse, but are a little bit easier to think about if you apply them to one unit of learning in a school. So an introduction is totally new to the material. Maybe you've heard of it, but this is the first time you're being served it as a learner. You need to practice that material that's new. So in order to get a handle of it, start to get your head around it. Once you are at the point where you mostly know the material, but you need to keep it fresh, you're at that review stage. Self-assessment and assessment have an important distinction because both are judging your competency in the material, but one is demonstrating how much you've mastered to yourself, and the other one is demonstrating mastery to someone else, and whether that is going to be recorded or just for reference. The ultimate mastery of a piece of content or learning that we want to attain is synthesis, which is when you have mastered the material, you can relate it to other knowledge that you have and come up with new ways of understanding both of those pieces of material. So when you're thinking about a game and thinking about, well, we want to teach someone something, are you trying to introduce that concept? Are you trying to make a space for them to review it, or are you testing them on this? And if so, are they testing themselves or being tested by others? The other thing to think about, and this is where needs becomes a little bit more tangible, is what will ensure learners actually play your game? Because if no one's able to play your game, then it's not actually going to make an impact, right? The first and most obvious one is cost. This costs time, this costs money. How much can you afford? How big of a game can you afford? Kind of similarly is equipment available. If you are aiming for this to be a mobile game, like to work on a cell phone, are employees and students allowed to have their personal cell phones on in their pocket when they're in this place of learning? Or do you need to make cell phones available? Is it an iPad? Is it a computer? How often is it available to the team? Time also is probably less than you think it would be. You have to account for the window of time you actually have minus the amount of time it takes to set up and break down. And maybe it's even that might be shorter if you're in a situation where you're training and someone could get pulled away in order to have a different form of on-hands training because a situation presents itself. You need to factor that in. Someone may not just have 30 minutes of a block to sit down and train. Determine if your content is up to date and relevant, because if you spend all this time making something that is actually out of date, that is double work on your part, and it also delegitimizes your game to learners because they also then have to do double work to learn. Sensitivity to audience, or don't be a butt. So for example, if you spend all of this time and care to translate your game into Lakota or Ojibwa, but you use like Redskin Indian caricatures of Native Americans in your game imagery, it doesn't matter that you've translated the games. You have invalidated that work and invalidated the audience you're trying to reach. So don't be a butt. Really consider who you're trying to reach and how best to meet them, and to be sensitive to their needs and their perspectives. The last one's a little tricky. You've probably heard of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is when you really want to do something because of its own reward. You just love to do it. You feel good doing it. And extrinsic motivation is you're doing it because you want something as a reward, or you're trying to avoid punishment for not doing it or for doing it poorly. Both of these are, ideally we want everybody to have intrinsic motivation to learn the thing that we find interesting and want to communicate. But you also will probably have to have some extrinsic motivation. You need to understand the difference between the two and resist the urge to lie to yourself if your game leans on extrinsic motivation alone. It's okay, but you need to make sure you understand that's what's happening in your game. So some examples, a bit more solid examples are easy to understand. Intrinsic motivation is self-satisfaction, feeling like you did a good job, well done, or that you're getting something, you're mastering it, belief in your work that it's actually matters. Helping others is a big one, even if they're digital. This is why Tamagotchis are popular, or Pokemon, right? We care about helping people and helping things, even if they don't actually exist. And curiosity can be an intrinsic motivator, whereas extrinsic can both be positive, like the super gamey elements that you think of, like badges, rewards, high scores, leaderboards. If you've ever been encouraged to post your score on Twitter, that is a form of extrinsic motivation because you're getting recognition and praise from your peers. It also, again, can be to avoid punishment. Extrinsic motivation includes obligation, expectation, fear of a bad grade, fear of consequences for getting something wrong or not doing something. And that kind of extrinsic motivation can end up very toxic if it is the only thing that is motivating someone. So we have the needs. We now need to research the needs. And good news is that you probably actually don't need to do this nearly as much as I do. Here are some real things that I have Googled as a designer, trying to learn some of the content and subject matter that I'm actually going to be making a game about. Symptoms of mild traumatic brain injury, pretty good, pretty standard, very interesting about learning about executive functions. How to play Trivial Pursuit. Never had played it, had to look it up on WikiHow. History of the light bulb. I'm a history major and light bulbs never came up, but that was pretty cool. Does moss contain lignin? The answer is no. The order that babies learn emotions. That wasn't actually for games, that was for one of my exhibit jobs. And it was fascinating learning about early childhood development because I don't have kids and I don't have a teaching background. And lastly, what are slugs made of? I never learned that one. So, you probably are an expert already, unlike me. You probably don't have to Google what slugs are made of. And if you know what they are made of, please tell me because I never found out. So take this time in the research phase to research all the other things we just mentioned in the gathering needs section. So who are your learner demographics? What accommodations do they need? Whether it's language accommodation, or if it's accommodations for disabilities. Maybe someone in your office is colorblind. If so, find out if they're red, green, or blue, purple colorblind. Content standards and requirements. This is where you update your content and make sure you label it and make sure you know where it is. Label those folders, otherwise it'll save you grief later. Time constraints. Find out exactly how much time people will have to play this game. The other thing that you may not think is research, but is very valuable, is find what the pain points are in your current training or places where people commonly misunderstand the material. That is if you can figure out what problems arise or where people get it mostly right, but they make an error in their understanding, or they don't quite, or it takes a while for them to get the model you want them to, really focus in on those. Because if your game can alleviate some of those pain points, you can figure that out, it'll be a boon to your training and help smooth everything out. Similarly, find out what works in your current training. If you can figure out, is it a tone? Is it a character that you use? Is it a particular sequence of how you order things? Or maybe people really like having 10-minute chunks of training because they can fit it in and it's just enough time for them to focus and learn something. Find what works and see if you can incorporate some of that in your game and make sure you're reinforcing that in your training overall. So besides the subject matter, which as we've established involves a lot of Googling for me, I also tend to research on a couple other things. One of them is existing games and mechanics. I don't limit myself to just other educational or positive impact games. If there's a mechanic that I think would work for a game, or I'm trying to figure out if it would be helpful for a game that I'm making, I look at video games overall and I gather references and start comparing how do they work with this model. So for example, here we have Horizon Zero Dawn, which is a definite entertainment game, has a dialogue tree where which is how, depending on how Aloy responds to a situation, says something about who Aloy is as a person. That is very similar to Equipped, which is a DEI training game, where you can see how you want to respond to something and learn about, like, maybe this is how you tend to respond to people overall, or respond to situations. I also look at the look and the feel and the vibe. This is helpful for me when I talk to UI designers and to artists, but it also is helpful for me to figure out what is the tone or the vibe of this game. If I have to write something, or I have to come up with a mechanics, or even if I want to say add some little fun details to make it more dynamic, this helps articulate what that should be. You know, do we want some whimsy? Does it have to be serious? This is also where you go back to being sensitive to your audience. Maybe a game about cancer is not going to have the same look as a game that is about, you know, customer service, or art, like this one is. In general, I firmly believe that games are strongest when used to teach a new way of thinking, which is why I love to work with custom games, where I work with a client and we figure out exactly the right kind of game that for their content. But you know what? Sometimes a gamified multiple choice is enough, and that is okay. When you are staring down hours of OSHA training and you just need anything to get through it, just a little bit of interactive elements and some variety of that interaction might be the thing that keeps you awake and actually remembering your OSHA content. And that is okay. Find the needs, and if they aren't that great, go for it. Just focus on that. Okay, we have a lot. We have a lot of needs. We have a lot of considerations. We have a lot of research now. There's just piles of paper physically on the desk, in our brains, in our Google Chrome tabs. What do we do with it? We need to sit and figure out what is going to happen and start that connection and translation process. And I like to call this phase composting. The phrase comes from poet and author Natalie Goldberg, from her book Writing Down the Bones, Freeing the Writer Within. I highly recommend you read the chapter. It is a page and a half long. You can find a PDF online, but this is the section that I wanted to highlight. She says, essentially, we are compost bins for every experience we have as humans. Our experience, our memories, our feelings, events that happen, every piece of media that we consume, we all absorb it. And over time, it sits, it changes, it evolves, it connects and combines with other things. And that is where our creativity comes from. That is where we need to be at this point, because we have a lot of stuff. We now have to figure out how to use it. So some of that might be just taking a day off and stepping back, or as long as you can, it may also just be like, hey, let's rearrange some things. Above all, why? Why are we doing this? Think about why. I find it extremely compelling that, at least in Western philosophy, I would love to hear more about other cultures' philosophies and conceptions of the underworld. But I find it very compelling that some of the worst punishments we could think of are punishments of futility. So Sisyphus pushing the boulder up a mountain, never to go to the top. Tantalus never able to eat or drink despite how much or how often he reaches. The idea that futility is the greatest punishment, to me, speaks volumes about the fact that if we want to be able to do something, if we want to compel people, or we want to encourage people to do something, or we're asking them to do something, giving them a reason why will help them do it. Even if they don't like to, they will find value in it, or they will find more value in it, and they will recognize the value that you see. So above all else, when you are looking at everything, think about, why is this important for people to know, and communicate that with your player. Don't just tell them it is, tell them why. I'm going to talk a little bit about identity systems and verbs. So in general, actually, one moment, I need to screen share. Identity systems and verbs are a model that I usually think about how to design mechanics for games, or what type of mechanics I want to approach with for a custom game. And I don't necessarily know if it would be useful to you all in terms of for picking a game mechanic, but I think it's a very good lens through which to think about how do we, like, where do we want to start, or what sort of where do we want to start with our game? So when it comes to identity, essentially we are asking the player to start and play as a role or identity that may not be there. This is my favorite example. It's called Adventures with Anxiety, where you don't play as a character with anxiety. You play as the character's anxiety, and it is your job as anxiety to protect your human. And it really gets to the point where anxiety is intrinsic. It's just part of our brains, and it is valuable. It's a defense mechanism. But the problem is that anxiety is too good at its job, and it can cause problems. And it's so as playing as the anxiety, we both get a sense of empathy, but also we get to see it in a different way than we would as a human with anxiety. Systems are, I think, what we tend to think of as being very gamey. It is very much you put input in, a bunch of stuff happens, and consequences then happen. So it's very good at connecting actions and variables to follow through effects, domino effects, waterfall. So anything that can trickle down or connect in weird ways. So for example, if you see from this, this is a game I worked on, iCivic's People's Pie. It was a remake. If you change the retirement age, yes, that means you get more money for usable income for the federal budget, but it makes people unhappy. And so so that system is where you can connect things. Another great example is Depression Quest. The basic system is the more depressed you are, the fewer choices you have. You see all of these things that you could do. You're physically unable to do them. And it does a really good job at showing that people with depression can't just snap out of it, and that they also see everything they can't do, and that has its own emotional toll. Verbs are fun. This is one I actually think that you can end up taking advantage of. Verbs, essentially, we want to look at the material and go, all right, what is fundamentally the thing we are asking people to do? So for example, chemistry, maybe we want to teach them stoichiometry, which is the balancing of chemical equations. The verb balancing. Can we make a game where the player is always balancing something, and by constantly balancing things, we are teaching them stoichiometry? Some verbs that might be useful to you are this idea of reprioritizing, which actually is sorting. So then if you can find a mechanic that uses sorting and bend that to prioritizing, that might be really cool. Identifying and diagnosing, linking and connecting. These are also verbs that we do a lot in our day-to-day lives, and can be leveraged to enforce content or concepts that relate or are necessary for the kind of connecting or linking or diagnosing that you're asking people to do. De-escalating is one I would love to see. So maybe we're thinking about customer service. Well, one major part of customer service that no one wants to practice a lot firsthand is de-escalating situations with difficult customers or clients. Having a game where you are only de-escalating situations would be great practice. And so it's not handling customers, the verb, it is de-escalating situations is the verb. Taking a little bit of a side thing here. A note on competition. So we all want our games to be played, and we genuinely want people to be interested in them. We want people to get excited about the things we're excited about. And we look at all the fun entertainment games that have thousands of players that spend thousands of hours to become masters of the game. And we're like, oh man, if we could replicate just a tiny bit of that, people would really get to learn and enjoy what we want them to learn. And realistically, we can't assure something is going to be fun or exciting or popular that we make. But we look at these games and we go, oh, they're competitive games, and we can make our game competitive. The problem is that if handled poorly, if introduced in a situation where it is not the time and place for competition, it can make the player uninterested at best and at worst demoralized. This is because competitive games are fun when you know the rules. Competitive learning games are fun when you know the material. And if you're asking people to compete on material that they don't know, maybe against people who actually do know the material, you're setting them up for failure. And that sucks. Competition is great, and it can be a great motivator, but it definitely 110% should be done and applied to review, assessment, and synthesis phases of learning. Introduction and practice, players do not have the context and the understanding of the material to compete with. They still need time to actually learn the material before they can start using it against other people. And so if you want to, as much as it may be tempting to try and make it more fun with competition, if you really do need to make an introductory game, competition's not the place. Save it for a review. Save it for an assessment. When it is the time and place for competition, so the places, the ones that were orange on that last slide, consider these options. And if you don't remember anything else, remember, only use competition after learners have been exposed to the material. Once they have, maybe consider competition with the self or team games before 1v1 competition. So something where you want to try and get a better score and beat your own high score last time. Or a team game like pub trivia, where you work together as a team against another team. That I think is actually really cool for review, because you can have moments of mastery and then you can fill in your own gaps and blind spots by when the other people jump in and go, oh, wait, I know this one. That can be very empowering and actually help the learning process before you get to the point where you can do one-on-one competition. Disable your timers. Timers in general are not accessible. And if you're already asking someone to compete on and know the material, the next level of difficulty is knowing the material quickly. Hold off on timers at first, maybe, and then when you are expecting them to be masters, add in the timers maybe. Use a variety of games and allow the player the option to opt into those games. So you may be competitive and really like baseball and hate tennis. And if you only have to play tennis, you're not going to want to do it. It's going to demoralize you because you're like, I have to keep doing this because I have to keep playing tennis because my boss told me to. That's also an opportunity for learners to see the same content in both games and go, I know the content, I just don't like this particular type of game. And that's also very good for self-confidence and understanding. If you use the training arcade at the arcades to make games freeform, this means that you can then let players replay the same formats they like and allow them to opt in to certain experiences on their own pace, learn on their own terms. And that can also be very empowering, because then you aren't trying to determine what is the best sequence, the best order of the format for everybody. You give them the power to decide what's best for themselves. They become more flexible. And also, last but not least, make it safe for learners to fail forwards, because getting it wrong is part of the process. They're not going to get it right away. If you're using competition in a public venue, or you're using it or you're making a game that is an assessment, make it very clear to them whether or not that assessment will be like part of their permanent record or being used to judge them against their peers. Because if that is your only option, you can only play competitive games, and it is always going to have consequence for you, we get back into that toxic form of extrinsic motivation, the fear of failure. I'm doing this and I have to be perfect in order to avoid punishment. Make sure that you allow spaces for your players to practice and to be assessed in ways that are not going to be consequential. That will build trust in between the learner, the player, and you for the moments when you do need to have it be have consequence or be assessed. Okay, so we composted all of the stuff, and now we're ready to make the game. At this point, I start thinking about documentation and storyboarding. Documentation specifically because as a designer, I need to take all the stuff and go, hi, development team, here's my idea for a game. What do you think? Is it impossible? But for you, it's probably going to be a little different. You need to actually pick a game. When it comes to the training arcade, we have a number of games. Each of them are very good at certain types of learning and certain scenarios. This is part of a flowchart that one of our instructional designers made, which I love. It breaks down what do you want people to do, the type of learning that you want them to engage with, and then actually says which of the games that we make would be best for that. I added in here which sections or which phases of learning these games are best used for. So for example, sorted and detective at the bottom, because they're for categorizing things, those are very good introduction, practice, and review. But if you want a review, assessment, or self-assessment sort of game, you can go straight into something like Wheel of Fortune or Jeopardy or Noodle. And don't worry, again, if you keep finding things that don't quite work for this game that you're working on, or there are certain concepts that would be better in separate things, you still have those buckets. Take it out of this game bucket, save it for later. It'll be okay. I love lists. They help make sure that I actually have everything that it needs to go in. Lists are great. Sketches are, I think, more useful when it comes to my custom design work, but if you're a visual thinker or trying to communicate roughly what you want or a look of something, they're great. Flowcharts I love. Those are useful if you have a game where you have consequences of your actions that can then lead to other consequences that can lead to others. Or if you want to map out, okay, someone has to learn this first, then this will make sense, then this can be used, etc. A chain of understanding. That's where I really like to use flowcharts as a map and a reference for when I'm building the game to make sure I'm making it make sense. If you're going to do anything with custom wording or scripts or just typing, lots of like question wording or phrasing, I strongly suggest doing it in a document or a spreadsheet first, because then you can edit it, you can revise it, you can set up for translations. A lot easier than just putting it directly into the game and then having to find it and edit it later. Very much recommend that. Before you build, if at any point you're stuck, I would suggest actually doing a walkthrough or a role play with someone and then writing down what you do. So if you're talking through, well, okay, if in a de-escalation scenario, here's the situation, here's the first step, second step, third step, talk it out with someone and have them write it down and use that as your model for how you want to build the game. Sometimes just going from brain to game or brain to document, it breaks. And being able to talk it out and then have that outline as an intermediary can be very helpful. And test it with everybody, new hires, new people, people who remember being new, managers, anyone who's going to use it, people outside the organization. Just test it. And then you'll be able to refine it and make it a better experience. At this point, we're building a game, and you've already done a lot of work. And you may find yourself in a situation like I did when I was doing my first design test to get my job at Filament. I spent 15 minutes recoloring those hand cursors so it would match the skin tone of the character that I had made for this design. And I remember it was before a pandemic, and I looked at my now husband and I went, why did I do this? I spent 15 minutes on this, why did I bother? And the reason is because it may not have mattered to me, but it would matter to someone with that skin tone. There are so many little things that we can do to make people feel seen, make something more accessible, make something more inviting to another person that realistically does not take a lot of time. If you're ever in the point where you're building the game and you're like, oh, this would be great, but it would take time, I don't know if it's worth it. The answer is probably yes. The answer is almost always yes, because it may not be worth it to you, but it would be to someone. And unless you've had that experience, it is almost impossible to be able to describe it. I hope you at some point do get to feel that experience. Some ways you can do this in your games, because you don't have Spider-Man doing sign language maybe. Use stock photos that reflect your actual demographics. If your employees are of a certain community, find some good stock photos that are your representations of that community. If you know it'll have to be translated, account for translations from the start. Make sure you have infrastructure and a plan for how you're going to get those translations to happen, because it's easier to start early than later. Disable timers. Again, they're not accessible and they are harder. They make it less accessible for people to actually use it if maybe English isn't their first language, or whatever first language you're making your game in, or for people with different types of disabilities. Similarly, avoid using turns of phrase, idioms, or slang. Those are hard for non-native speakers, but they're also hard to understand for people with, for example, autism, who may think very literally, or who had to learn their primary language as if it was a second. Cover the same content in different forms, because everybody likes to learn in a different way. It also adds variety. It just makes it so much easier. Remember the poor cat who was doing OSHA training and was bored out of its tiny brain. Add a little bit more complexity to the game. If you want to add little details, those loving touches really, and that little bit of time really does matter. It makes it noticeably a richer experience. And when it's clear that you cared about the game and the info that is in the game, it is felt by the learner and the player, and it makes the information and the content of the game feel more. Lastly, ask questions and ask for help. I live by this comic every single day when I work with my team and work with clients. I firmly believe it is better to ask dumb questions than make dumb assumptions. So I encourage you to ask us and me dumb questions. So that way, and if you ever want to work with us, I would look forward to asking you some dumb questions as well. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I was busy typing. What can I say? Okay, so this is the part of the webinar where we get to ask Lydia questions. Right now, we have one specifically in the Q&A bubble that says, hi, is there some free, better quality software I could use to create games for informal learning?
Ooh. Free software. It will come with the, it'll be your mileage may vary, and it depends on how techy you are. For example, if you like branching dialogue, Twine is a great resource. There are other narrative styles of games where you have minimal to no coding. When it comes to other games, though, I think if you want to have more interactions than kind of the text-based, pick a text, then go through, you are going to end up finding more. Either you're going to need to start working on game development and find some, and learn some coding yourself to do something like Game Maker or Unity or Godot or some other engine, or you're going to have to spend some money to access pre-made games like the Training Arcade, where you can then work with the tools that have already been developed. I will unfortunately say a lot of the ones that are very user-friendly, they take a lot of time to develop from folks like me. So that is why they cost money. But there are also a lot of resources from game devs and people starting game development where you can research what would be good for your needs. I hope that wasn't too hand-wavy of an answer.
I don't think so, not at all. Okay, so another question. We had a bunch of people who were very, very excited about that flow chart that you had in your presentation a few slides back. Mm-hmm. Are you able to share that flow chart?
That is not up for me to decide because it was shared to me by my manager from the instructional designers. So Kristen, that would actually be really worth asking Ellen if we could then ask the owner of that flow chart to release it.
I am making a note right now. We will ask Ellen if we can release that flow chart to all of our participants. It's a great question.
If it would be helpful, maybe add an additional version with the subsections I made as well. So like, this is an introductory game, this is good for practice, etc., as a additional variant on that. Gotcha. But that's not my work. That's very, very lovely work from someone else, and I want them to get full credit.
Understood. All right, I'm going through the rest of the chat just in case. Does ELB Learning offer unpaid internships, as I am an e-learning and gaming student? You know what? The question is always no unless you ask. We will have to go into that department and ask whether or not that's a possibility, because I think it's a great idea, but I'm only in marketing, so I don't know yet. We will have to find that one out too.
We have had interns with the training arcade before. I think this summer we actually had 2. And so if that is something that can happen, that would be great.
Hey, Lydia, who do you think they should reach out to then over at, because we purchased the training, the TGA, the game, or, you know what? It's been so long since I've actually called them the game agency, because we acquired them so many years ago. But who would we contact over at our game division?
That is something on your to-do list. I would have said Donald, and I'm not sure how that role got distributed off of his.
Got it. I will ask. That's another question that I'm going to have to answer, and we will make sure that we put that answer in the email as well.
Probably CC Jamal, because I believe he was one of the touchstone, or one of the people who checked in on our interns consistently through the process. So he'd also be a good person to call.
Okay, and we have another one. Can we integrate the games in Training Arcade in our storyline courses?
That is a good question. I am actually pretty new to storyline. I do not know. I think that would be a better question for one of the Training Arcade devs. So probably either Jamal or I would say Greg would have that experience if we've done it before.
Man, it looks like we have a lot of questions to follow up on. I'm pretty sure that the Training Arcade plays nice in the sandbox because of SCORM to begin with, but we will verify, not a problem.
Yeah, so that is one thing I can say is that when you make a game, you can download the SCORM file, and anything that you can then use a SCORM for, assumedly, you can then use that file to upload and make use of.
Understood. Awesome. Yeah. Along that point, can Training Arcade games be integrated into an LMS via LTI or SCORM? If I'm correct, that answer is SCORM file.
Yes.
Do we have anything else? Anyone? Anyone? You can see the QR code on Lydia's slide. If you would like to schedule a free trial, basically you chat with one of our people, because as Lydia has shown you, creating games is not just, hey, insert this here and make that go there. It's a little bit more difficult, so it's a little bit more in depth than just drag and drop. So you would speak to someone and then be able to get a free trial of the Training Arcade and also Arcade. So hopefully you'll scan that QR code and schedule some time with us, and we'll be able to chat with you and basically see if we can start a relationship. All right, thanks for sharing the workflow, giving so much inspiration. Thank you so much, Lydia. Thank you so much to everyone who has come today and is a part of our webinar. We truly appreciate you, and have a wonderful day.